Okay, I think we've got a few more people that we're expecting, but they may come through as we get underway. It's often the case people come in the first 5 minutes or so. So we will get started, and I'd like to say, firstly, welcome. Thank you for joining us for our Press Play webinar this week, which is on nurturing language development in infancy and early childhood. And it's very exciting for me personally, and I know probably for all of you that jump on. We all know how important early language and communication is, how much of a difference it makes to early interactions for children and their overall development. And I think also from what we hear from parents around our playgroups in particular is a great deal of interest in the idea of how language development happens, particularly for bilingual children and not just for monolingual children. So I think this is going to be a great webinar, and I'm really, really looking forward to hearing from Karen here. But to begin with, I'd like to acknowledge that we are all meeting on Aboriginal country. Here at Playgroup New South Wales, we're on the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, and I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise their continuing connection to land and waters. We're so lucky for that care of country because it's where children now live and play and have the capacity to thrive. I'd also like to extend my respects to elders past and present and to any First Nations people here today. So just to introduce our guest speaker today, Associate Professor Karen Mattock, who's from Western Sydney University's BabyLab at the MARCS Institute. She's a developmental psychology researcher whose work explores how infants and children develop language. She has expertise in speech perception, babbling and word learning. And as I mentioned, and that's for monolingual and bilingual contexts. With a PhD from Western Sydney Uni and research experience at McGill and Lancaster Universities, Dr. Mattock's research deepens our understanding of how factors like bilingualism, language exposure, and caregiver speech shape early language development. So really excited. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Karen, but just to tell you a little bit about myself, my name's Jenny Kemp. I'm the executive lead for Impact here at Playgroup New South Wales and come from a background of occupational therapy and bring a lot of experience across disability and child and family services over the years. But my passion has always been the early years, really looking to how children can thrive, learn and belong. A couple of housekeeping things before I pass over to Karen is we are recording this session. So if you do not want your image to be on screen, feel free to turn your camera off. We know you're there. You can definitely use the chat to ask any questions, and we will try to pick up on those questions at the end of the presentation if time permits. And if you have any other questions, just pop them in the chat. We've got some technical support here as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Karen, and hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, for the lovely introduction and the warm welcome, and for the very kind invitation to join you today at Playgroup New South Wales webinar series. I'd like to also thank Jada for getting us all set up today. I will just share my screen, so just fingers crossed. Can you see that screen okay? Okay, I'll just check with Jennifer. Can you see the slide only view there, Jennifer?
I can, Karen. It's all good.
Perfect. Thank you. I think we're ready to go. Thanks, everyone. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which Western Sydney University campuses stand. We're a multi-campus university, and we're on the lands of the Darug, Eora, Darawal and Wiradjuri nations. And so I thank the traditional custodians' support of our work at BabyLab and Western Sydney on their lands. I also pay respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people present today. So, did you know that a baby's brain forms over 1 million new connections every second? And how do we make those connections count? Well, the main way is through language, through every conversation and every story. So every time we're having an interaction with a young infant or a child and saying things like, look at the red ball, just everyday phrases that we use with children. It's not just teaching them the words, it's wiring the brain's fundamental architecture for learning. And we also know, as Jennifer actually mentioned in her welcome, that language and communication creates the scaffolding for social emotional development as well, for bonding, for that back and forth responsiveness between caregiver and infant, which increases the oxytocin for the infant and plays a key role in soothing baby's stress. So it's supporting healthy brain and socio-emotional development as well. And we know how important play is for fostering the whole dynamic of language and communication between caregiver and child. So hi everyone, it's great to be here. I'm Karen. I'm an Associate Professor in Psychological Science. I'm in the School of Psychology at Western Sydney University and also at the MARCS Institute for Brain, Behaviour and Development, and I'm a researcher in the MARCS BabyLab. Now, I've been researching how babies learn and produce speech for 20 years or so now. And the focus of my work is on how babies learn one or more languages and how their brains respond differently to language, depending on whether it is their own language or a language that's unfamiliar to them or a non-native language. And I'm also a mum of a 14-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son. That's my son in the picture there on the screen, taking part in a BabyLab study. He was about 8 months old there. And this has been wonderful to be both parent and researcher because I get a front row seat to watch some of this science unfold in real life. So here my son is taking part in an EEG study where he's wearing an electrode cap, which sits on the head and picks up the electrical activity of his brain as he's listening to speech sounds. And this was one of my PhD students' studies a few years ago. We have 3 BabyLabs in Western Sydney University, at Westmead, at Kingswood and Bankstown. So there's bound to be one near you. And here at the BabyLab, as you already know, we study language, communication and cognitive development from birth. So with 3 labs in Western Sydney, we invite parents to take and their infants to take part in our studies. They can come and register to take part in our studies. And so all the science that we know about language development is coming directly from working with these families. Now, Western Sydney is such a fabulous place to conduct BabyLab research on language development because there's such a diversity of languages in Western Sydney and it's so multicultural. There's over 100 languages spoken in Western Sydney. And just to give you a little bit of a picture about what that means for our study, my recent honours students who were completing a language and numeracy study in the BabyLab recruited babies of all different linguistic backgrounds, and there was not one single baby with the same pairing of languages as another in that study. And that is quite incredible. And there's not many places in the world, I think, that have that richness of language diversity on their doorstep. So we're very, very privileged here in Western Sydney to work with families with such diverse linguistic backgrounds. Now, at BabyLab, we are interested in understanding language development, but we're also we really want to take that science to the world. So we translate that research through engagement activities and we share resources with families and educators and health professionals because we really don't want that science to stay locked in the lab. It's that engagement, that sharing of our science findings is really important. So you might be wondering a little bit about what happens in the baby lab. So how do we know what babies know? So while we're interested in language development, often the babies that we're working with aren't even saying their first word yet. So how do we know what they know? Well, we engage baby in, depending on their age and the kind of study, different activities or games where we can learn a bit about what they know. So for our youngest babies, they would take part, for example, in either a passive kind of listening study, which would be like EEG studies, where we're measuring their changes in their brain to changes in speech sounds, for example, or they might be looking at pictures on the screen that correspond to certain speech sounds where we might habituate them to one kind of sound, and when their looking time to that image drops because they're getting bored because they're hearing the same thing over and over, we then switch the sound and see if they have a recovery in their looking time to the screen. We keep the picture on the screen the same in that instance. Or we might give babies access to different sounds by looking at different pictures and choosing what they listen to. So there's lots of ways that we can find out what babies know without them even actually telling us through their own babble or first words. So here's what we'll explore together today. So we're going to look at how babies' brains build language or build capacity for language from birth. And I'm going to share some of the things that we've learned through our studies at MARCS BabyLab. And I'm going to focus on 3 core principles that shape communication: the specialized listener, the pattern detective, and the power of timing. So we're going to talk about each of those today in this webinar. I'll also be speaking to and making suggestions for everyday strategies for families and for play groups to engage with their children. And they're not tricky things, okay? They're just little things, and you probably know many of them already, but you may learn how and in what way they're important for specialized listening, for detecting patterns in speech, and why timing is so important. So let's keep that a little bit of a mystery for the moment. And at the end of the presentation, I will share with you some key takeaways. So why is this all important? So why is language something that we're interested in? Well, language is how we connect, it's how we think, and it's how we share meaning. It's how we transmit knowledge, how we communicate our culture. And it's really the most extraordinary of human achievements. What's amazing is that babies are born ready to communicate. They're listening, they're watching, and they're responding right from the start. In fact, they even have access to sound in utero during the last trimester of pregnancy and the prenatal development. So they already have access to mum's speech in particular, okay, as they're hearing mum's speech from being inside the womb, and they're also hearing their native language or languages around them. It's a bit muffled because they are in utero, but they are able to pick up the rhythm and intonation patterns in utero. So when they're born, they're already a little bit familiar with sound. But we know that the first few years of life are the critical window, also known as the critical period of brain development, because it's during this period that through exposure and experience to language, and that is a must. You don't just learn language, you have to be hearing it to learn it. And so through exposure and experience with language, those neural pathways, those brain connections are being laid down at an astonishing rate. And what's most important is that everyday interaction with you, the caregiver, okay? Yes, learning apps, screen time can have some uses, but the best way to learn Language is through everyday social interaction, face-to-face interaction. And we know that play is so important. It gives children natural opportunities to communicate. It gives them opportunities to experiment to words, to learn social dialogue and negotiation and problem-solving skills. So it's not just about hearing the words and learning, what sounds and what words are in their language. It's the whole package. It's about learning social interaction with others and how language works in context, that building of vocabulary, that turn-taking, that storytelling. And as parents and caregivers, we can help engage children in fun and meaningful ways to learn language through play and interaction. So today we'll look at 3 evidence-based principles that explain how children learn to communicate. The specialized learner is focused on how babies tune into the sounds. The pattern detective, they are little detectives, and they're learning about language through repetition and picking up the patterns and the regularities in language. And the power of timing. This is especially where we come in as caregivers, for the others as well. But here I'm talking about engaged and responsive interactions from caregivers and those around the child. So let's unlock each of these with some key research findings and some practical strategies for nurturing language development. What do I mean about the specialized learner? So I've already hinted that babies' hearing is fully functional in utero. This happens around 25 to 26 weeks in utero. So they're hearing the rhythm and intonation. They're not hearing the clarity of speech sounds that we hear out of the womb. It's like they're hearing underwater. It's kind of muffled. But we know from research that what babies hear in utero, they actually have some memory for, they can remember and demonstrate preferences for after birth. So it has been established since the 1980s that babies prefer to listen to their mother's voice at birth over the voice of an unfamiliar female stranger. Now, they measure this in newborns through what's called the high amplitude sucking procedure. So they give baby a dummy or a pacifier that's hooked up to a transducer, and they measure the change in sucking rate to the different voices. So either familiar mum's voice or recording and an unfamiliar female's voice recording. The newborns prefer mum. They also prefer to listen to stories or hear songs that were read to them prenatally as well. And they also prefer the rhythm of their native language. So when we low pass filter or muffle out English, say, and Spanish, for example, and play those muffled recordings like the babies would have heard in utero, they prefer to listen to that muffled recording of the language that they had exposure to in utero, which is their native language. So they show that native language preference right from the get-go at birth. But what's also quite spectacular is that newborns are universal listeners. So aside from hearing, a little bit about their native language in utero towards the end of into the third trimester, they actually don't know what the language they're going to be born into necessarily. And so babies' brains come prepared to learn every or any language of the world. And for that reason, newborn babies and very young infants have better speech perception abilities than we do as adults. So if you've ever tried to learn a second language as an adult, I'm trying to learn Spanish at the moment. It is difficult because there are some speech sound contrasts that aren't in English and I'm a monolingual English speaker, and I find it very difficult to hear the differences between words that are distinguished by those sound contrasts or sound pairs that we don't have in English. Now, a newborn baby, though, can tell the difference between both native and non-native pairs of speech sounds. So if you take like one of the classic examples from the research is Japanese infants' perception of versus or the R versus L distinction. Now, native speaking Japanese adults have really great difficulty hearing this distinction in English because it doesn't exist in Japanese. But very young Japanese babies can hear this very clearly and can distinguish between those sounds because their brain is open to learning any language, okay? And it's through exposure and experience with your native language or native languages that a perceptual narrowing occurs, okay? So initially they can hear all these wonderful combinations of speech sounds from any of the world's language, but if you're not using it, you lose it. So your speech perception abilities then hone in to the native language or languages that you're learning. And we call this process perceptual narrowing or perceptual reorganization. And it's actually adaptable and functional, okay? Because you want to be an optimal speaker and listener in the language or languages that you're learning. So for a bilingual or a multilingual child, they might have, some overlap in speech sounds and patterns depending on the combinations of languages they're learning, but the multiple languages could also be quite distinct. So in that sense, they might have more to learn. But they still also will narrow their speech perception abilities, or their speech perception abilities will narrow through exposure and experience with the specific languages that they have experience with. So we're filtering out what we don't need to focus on what we do need to be optimal users of our language or languages. Now, one of our key studies was looking at this in for tone language speech sounds. So this was a study that I conducted in the early 2000s as part of my PhD, but it was the first demonstration of this perceptual reorganization of speech perception for tone languages. And in this study, we had babies actually tested at the BabyLab, because I was the first PhD student to come through the BabyLab back in the day, a long time ago. So we had monolingual English speaking babies, and we had monolingual Chinese babies. So these were babies that were either learning Mandarin or Cantonese. It was a mixed group, but both Mandarin and Cantonese are tone languages. So they use pitch patterns at the syllable level to distinguish word meanings. And this is also a feature of languages like Thai as well. Now, we predicted that the youngest babies in the study at 6 months of age would be able to hear the differences between the tone language speech sounds, regardless of whether they were English learning babies or Chinese learning babies, because at 6 months of age, babies' speech perception abilities are still very broad. They're still universal-like. But with age and increasing experience with their native language, their speech perception would hone in to just the sounds that are relevant in their language. So for the babies learning English at 9 months, they weren't able to discriminate between these lexical tone contrasts anymore. So I'm talking about differences like bar versus bar. Okay, it's much more subtle than that because I'm not a native speaker of Mandarin, but just to give you an idea. And so the Chinese babies were able to maintain that discrimination of those tone sounds, which are important in their language, but the English learning babies were no longer able to demonstrate that they could hear that distinction at 9 months of age. And we tested these babies using what's called the conditioned head turn procedure. So the babies were actually trained or taught to turn their head to a dancing toy when they heard the change in speech sound. And so the youngest 6-month-olds all did this very reliably. But with age and increasing language experience, the 9-month-olds, English learning infants, were no longer able to hear the difference, so they did not demonstrate the head turn to get the reward of the dancing toy, but the Chinese infants were. So this is some evidence for that perceptual narrowing or that perceptual reorganization. And this kind of reorganization or narrowing also occurs for infants babbling. So some of my work has looked at babbling babies, so from across the first year of life. So when babies first start making marginal babble kinds of sounds around 4 months, so it sounds a little bit like a syllable, but it's not fully formed yet, and it's mostly vowel sounds. But the sounds they're producing are very language general. So when you record the baby's sounds and then you measure them acoustically, you can see that there's nothing necessarily matching up to the kind of acoustic properties of like the way adults would produce those sounds. But as the baby gets further into the babbling stage and starts to canonical babble, so babbling like ba, 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 da, 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 and so on, which is later in the first year of life, around 9-10 months of age, we started to see a shift in the way babies produce those syllables, depending on the language that they were learning. So in particular, we were looking at babies learning English and babies learning French. And the way they were producing those syllables was different based on the language they were learning by the end of that first year of life. So there is a reorganization of babbling as well. And remember that for both reorganization of speech perception and reorganization of babbling, this is through exposure and experience with the native language or languages. Now, what happens with bilinguals? So they're hearing more than one language. They've got potentially, depending on how similar or different those multiple languages are, more to learn. There might be some overlaps if the languages are very close in the kinds of speech sounds that they have, but they can also be very different. Okay, so they've got more to learn. Okay, now, if they are multilingual, they are not getting 100% of their language input from just one of their language, like a monolingual is. Okay, so I grew up with just English. I was hearing English all the time. For a multilingual child, they are hearing their languages, but of their 100% of time hearing language, there's some kind of partition between how much they're hearing one language and how much they're hearing the other or others' languages. So their sort of total time of hearing all of the languages is not equivalent to what the monolingual hears. But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing, okay? When you think that your ultimate goal, or the ultimate goal of bilingualism is being able to speak and be fluent in more than one language, that's amazing. So, in infant development and early childhood, we may see some milestones reached a little bit later. They used to call this the bilingual delay. Okay, it's certainly not a delay. There's more to learn and they need more exposure to get there, okay? But any kind of time that it might take that's a little bit longer, we're talking months, okay? It's only a few months that they could be behind, okay? And then they will catch up. So it's certainly nothing to worry about, but it's definitely something that parents worry about a lot and that they talk to us a lot about when they come to the lab, okay? I think, it's an absolute blessing to be able to learn more than one language from early infancy and early childhood. And they'll get there in their own time. And this delay narrative really came from, at the time, how we were measuring bilingual development. At that time, things are changing now. People were comparing bilinguals to a monolingual gold standard. And, well, they're not ever going to be on par with a monolingual if you're doing that, because the starting point is so different and you're not assessing the bilingual from the perspective of their language input. But once researchers started to do that and to test babies from their perspective, they can see that they succeed under that variable input and adapt flexibly to it and attune to both of their systems. So I just want to talk to you about a study that we conducted. This was with babies learning English only, babies learning French only, and babies learning English and French, so bilingual English-French babies. When we tested monolingual, so here we taught babies the names of nonsense objects, okay? We do this because we don't want them to have sort of top-down knowledge that might interfere with the phenomena that we're looking at. So we called this object, say, a bose, and this one a gosse. And we had a French speaker say the words bose, and an English speaker say the words bose and multiple tokens of those. And we tested English babies on the word learning task where they had to learn these words, where they only heard the English pronunciations. And then we tested them on a version of the task, a different set of babies, on a version of the task where they heard bilingual presentation of the sound. So sometimes when they saw this, they'd hear an English speaker saying bose, and sometimes they'd hear a French speaker saying bose. Well, guess what? The monolingual English babies did not do very well on this task. They did not learn the words successfully when they were given the bilingual input. So there you go. We'd flipped that bilingual delay by testing, we tested these bilingual babies on learning words that were produced in French accents and English accents, just like they were hearing at home. And they outperformed the monolinguals tested on that variable input that they were hearing. So I just want to highlight that this kind of delay, bilinguals, a delayed narrative that you hear, is often because we're not testing the babies from their perspective. We flipped that here. We tested the monolinguals from the bilinguals' perspective, and the monolinguals didn't do very well. So this tells us that you should be, to understand a baby's language development, you should be testing that baby or assessing that baby from the perspective of the languages that they're learning. So why is this important? Well, and what can be helpful here? So if a baby is learning about speech sounds, then we need to make sure that we're talking directly to them as often as we can, and really embrace that infant-directed speech and child-directed speech as well for older children. That's really important, because when we speak to babies in that special register of infant-directed speech, or you might have heard it called motherese, we are exaggerating the speech sounds, okay? So in doing that, we're emphasizing the end sort of points of those sounds, and we're creating these really clear acoustic but also articulatory targets. So what your face is doing when you exaggerate those speech sounds, and the babies are learning from that. Okay, it's teaching them about the way speech sounds sound and are produced. So we want to minimize the chaos. Of course, we have busy households, we have busy lives, but if we are engaging, one-on-one with our kids, let's try and turn off the TV in the background, turn off the radio if we're playing, and have that minimal sort of background chaos going on. If you're a parent of a bilingual, mixing the languages is fine. So you can say agua and water in one sentence, that's fine. The bilingual brain is very, very flexible, and that kind of mixed exposure does build that flexibility. And one thing that parents often ask us is if in their family they might be bilingual, but based on maybe the language of what the parents are speaking and what is their common language that they communicate in, there may be one language that they're hearing more than another language. And that's okay as well. Just keep speaking that other language that's not as frequent. Baby will pick it up. And in the long run, they'll still be a native speaker of that language because they've had that exposure and experience from birth. So don't give up on those other languages, even if they're not spoken as frequently in the home as perhaps another one is. Let's move on now to baby the pattern detective. So word learning and vocabulary are huge milestones in language, but how does an infant learn what a word is, or what a word is, where a word starts and finishes? Well, they do this because they're a pattern detective. So when we talk, we're hearing words, but we don't actually pause between words. So if I said, do you want to play with the ball? Do you want to play with the ball now? You're hearing that as an adult speaker of English as discrete words, but the speech signal isn't actually like that. Okay, it's our top-down knowledge. We have a vocabulary already. We know what the words are. And so when we hear those sound strings that map that, we know that they're the words. But babies are working from the bottom up. So what do I mean by that? So I often show this to my students and I say, okay, here is a waveform of an utterance, okay, or speech. Tell me where you think the words are. And they usually say, there's a word boundary where those blue lines are. Okay, so they'd say that there's, probably 3 words in that utterance. But what if I showed you that this is where the words are? And what you'll notice is there's never actually a silent spot here. There's no gaps in the speech. It's continuous. And where it looks like there might be a gap, that's not actually a word boundary at all. So how are babies working out what's going on here? So this utterance is, wow, that's so good. So babies are detecting the patterns in speech. So they're tracking which sounds go together to find the words. So they're little statistical learners. They're tracking how often certain sounds occur together. And they're using that pattern of regularity or lack of regularity to work out where the words are and aren't in a continuous speech stream. So for example, in English, the sound ends words like sing or song. But in English, that sound doesn't start words. But in Vietnamese, that sound can start words. Now, we don't tell a Vietnamese baby that that's the rule, and we don't tell an English baby that the rule's different for them. They're picking that up through hearing the speech. They are tracking the statistical patterning of the speech sounds and how they go together in their language. Now, our research that I highlighted just a bit earlier with the word learning was showing us that bilingual infants are doing this as well because they're learning words across variable pronunciations, while the monolinguals struggled with this because that didn't map up with their native input. So the bilingual children's pattern detectors had adapted to more complex and variable input, but the monolinguals had not. So babies don't just figure out the names or labels of objects from a single moment, okay? So if you said the word, say you were playing with a ball with a child and you said the word ball, the baby's not going to learn it from that first instant necessarily, okay? And the baby has to learn that the word ball refers to the object, the ball, and not a property of the object, like its color or its shape or its size. And it's only going to work that out over different instances of you saying the word ball with a round object and, the toy ball, all different toy balls around them, okay? And then over time, they're tracking those patterns and mapping that sound or that label ball to the object ball and not a property of that object. We also see that for the bilingual infant, they are tracking those statistics across varied pronunciations and across varied words. So in addition to learning ball, a bilingual baby that's learning Spanish and English also has to learn that pelota means ball. And so that there's actually two different labels in their world that refer to the one object. So they're using their statistical tracking abilities to work out that those two labels refer to that ball, but in different contexts. So in an English context, it's ball, and in a Spanish context, it's pelota. So this is really quite remarkable cognitive flexibility and ability to track statistical regularities in speech, both within and across languages. So how can we help baby here? Well, we can help them be pattern detectors by engaging with them in good quality speech. And quantity is also important as well, because through repetition, baby will learn those regularities. So when you're doing your regular routines with babies, talk about what's going on, shoes on, bath time, all done, and that kind of consistent phrasing, is helping baby track the regularity. I'm not saying be robotic about it, but we do have routines. And so using those same words is important. And if you have a bilingual child, calling the ball a pelota, if the baby's learning Spanish as well, is also good. And it's okay to mix that. They'll still track over time that those two words refer to that object. And don't worry about how much input you have from one or the other languages. If the child's bilingual, any exposure to multiple languages is good, and baby will learn over time. It might take them a while to catch up in, say, one language, but they will get there with that continued exposure and experience. The last point that I want to talk about is the power of timing. So this is the third principle that's important for language development. And it's about connection, and it's about how timing builds communication. Now, I'm not talking about, watching the clock here. What I'm talking about is the timing of your response to baby serving you a gesture, a cue, a sound, a word, okay? Your response, whether that be a smile, a word, a nod, a phrase, an engagement of attention or shared joint attention, is the return. So this process is known as serve and return. And it's a really simple concept, but it's foundational to brain development. And we do this through responsive infant-directed speech. We do it through our smiles, okay? We do it through our eye gaze. We do it through our joint attention when we're pointing at objects with baby, or holding objects and talking about the object and engaging with baby at the same time, or if both caregiver and baby have shared attention to an object. This is responsive interaction, and that timing's really important. So you want to be engaged, you want to be responding as soon as you can after the baby initiates that serve, if you're in a face-to-face interaction with them. So something like, within seconds, okay? The babies will vocalize more if your response to them is contingent on them serving you, okay? If your return is contingent on that, they will vocalize more. They will engage more. And their babbling, they might babble for a little longer because they've had an engaged, communicative interaction with you. Now, in our busy lives, it is sometimes hard to carve out time in the day, if you're a caregiver, to have that quality playtime with your child. But if you can, set aside short blocks of time when you can during the day, where the phone's away, the TV's off, you're playing with baby, you're following baby's lead. This is so valuable for strengthening that responsive communication, that engaged communication, and is really important for baby's language development. We know this through infant-directed speech research. MARCS BabyLab is quite famous for research in infant-directed speech. We know that it maintains attention between caregiver and infant. It communicates emotion. It facilitates language acquisition. We know that parents that use infant-directed speech with their babies earlier in life, that their babies go on in the second year of life to have larger vocabularies and better word learning skills. And we also know it's important for bonding. It's important for attachment. It's those moments, those important moments of connection. And that's just as important as hearing the words themselves. Now, we know that building vocabulary does rely on social interaction and understanding of the pragmatic context as well. So it's not just about hearing sounds. It's about children's ability to interpret the speaker's intent and the communicative context. Now, bilingual children who regularly hear multiple labels for the same object, so think ball or pelota for the English-Spanish bilingual child, they're showing greater flexibility because they're able to learn to use these social cues, these socio-pragmatic cues for language learning to help guide them to understand the meaning, okay? So they have to be able to interpret the speaker's intent, the communicative context. You know, are we speaking Spanish here? Are we speaking English here? Does that matter? Hang on, oh, they said that that word ball. That's what that maps to. Then it suddenly flipped to pelota, okay? So they're reading the social cues, the pointing, the eye gaze, the smiles from the caregiver to navigate a complex linguistic environment. So it's not just about what they're hearing, it's about how the caregiver is communicating with them. And bilingual children are much more flexible at picking up on this. So how can we be responsive in our engagement with babies? With our baby. So play with your baby, talk to your baby, do so face to face. Baby learns a lot from your emotions and the movement associated with speech and language. Quality beats quantity, okay? We can't spend 12 hours a day solidly talking to our baby. Life, that would be amazing, but life doesn't really allow us that. But talk to your baby as much as you can and have that really precious, engaged, full interaction across the day, even if it's just in 10-minute blocks a couple of times a day. So valuable. And while we're talking about timing, I just want to share a little about our understanding of the timing of developmental milestones. So these are milestones for speech development, from recognizing voices at birth all the way up to the word spurt or vocabulary spurt from 18 months up to short phrases. Now, parents often speak to us when they come to the lab because they are worried that their baby isn't hitting milestones, as the books say. Okay. This is okay. There is some flexibility around these milestones, but certainly if anyone is ever worried about their child's language development, they should talk to a health professional about it. But there can be lots of reasons why, baby might not be hitting milestones. Maybe they have had repeated ear infections, for example. Maybe they're learning 3 or 4 languages or 2 languages and they just need that little more time. Maybe it's the personality of the baby. They kind of sit back and watch a bit more than be a chatty baby, okay? There's many, 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 many reasons. And so these milestones are just a guide, okay? Like any other milestone in development, they are a guide. Now, at the BabyLab, we do have a Aussie short form vocabulary checklist, which is normed for Australian children's vocabulary development. It's a checklist that's available on the BabyLab website for parents to complete on their child's vocabulary knowledge. That QR code will take you to the page where that checklist is. Now, this is an authorised adaptation of the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory, and the MARCS team, headed by Professor Caroline Jones, developed this tool because Australian English-speaking children were being compared to the vocabulary norms of either British infants or American English infants, because the MacArthur-Bates scales were normed in those populations. And one of the biggest kind of no-nos for comparing a child to norms is to be comparing to norms of, babies or children in another country, okay? Because the social and environmental context of a child's development is so important. So it can be not very meaningful. So MARCS has the Aussie short form. It is available for parents to use. You can complete it online and then you get a report sent to you afterwards. And so this is actually really helpful for parents to work out, how many words their child knows. It's suitable to be used for children aged 12 to 30 months. And after you complete it, you'll get a report emailed to you. Now, it's not a diagnostic tool, but it's certainly something that parents can take to a health professional to start a discussion about their child's language development if they're worried. Now, vocabulary development in bilinguals, we should be counting differently too, okay? We want to count the total words that a bilingual child knows across their languages. So all the unique concepts they know, rather than comparing what they know in each language to the norms for children who are monolingual in that language, okay? So we're counting all the unique concepts. And this notion of mixing, counting that mixing language, and when you have a bilingual child mixing language, that's also very normal as well. And it's actually quite sophisticated because it requires a level of cognitive control and flexibility. Okay, so to wrap up then, we've talked about the specialized learner, how your baby tunes in to the speech sounds of their language or languages, and that talking to your baby is the best tool in your kit. So quality and quantity of input is really important. Your baby is a pattern detective. To help them out, let's engage in those quality interactions. Let's repeat words. Don't say ball once, say it multiple times. Help them find what those words are. Be engaged and responsive to your baby or young child's serves, okay? That builds quality interaction, and it's that connection and consistency that matters the most, almost more than just hearing the sounds themselves, okay? Because you can have sounds playing in the background, but if you're not engaging with them, if you're not engaging with someone speaking, you're not going to learn. So that connection and consistency matters the most. And for parents and caregivers and educators of bilingual children, nurture it, cherish it. There will be times that you're worried, you know, that's normal as a parent, and same for the parent of a monolingual child. But the benefits of bilingualism extend beyond just being a fluent speaker of the language. We know there's cognitive benefits across the lifespan. There's social benefits. There's a whole world of opportunities out there, and there's connection to culture and heritage. And that's so important to one's family and identity. So we would absolutely love for you to visit us at the BabyLab. To find out more, we've got the QR code there, which will take you to the site. And our register is always open to families who are interested in participating in our studies. And there's a form that you can complete there, and that gives us permission to contact you should a study that you're eligible for come up. And of course, at that time, you can choose whether you'd like to participate or not. But thank you so much, everyone. Do connect with us. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karen. What a great and interesting presentation. And I really love the way you divided it up into the specialised listener, the pattern detective, and the power of play. And also, I do think it's really lovely living in Sydney to really hear how we can honour bilingualism, how we can understand that children who are learning two languages are actually, they're actually developing great flexibility, that it's a real asset to have those languages, and to be reassuring families that this is an okay way to develop, and to be really comfortable with speaking their home language, because I know that is something that parents often say to us is something that they worry about should they be trying to speak English. So I think it's really reassuring to hear that, and thank you for that. I am conscious of the time, so if anyone does have a burning question, now would be the time to ask it. So feel free to jump in. There's only a small group left online, so if anyone has a burning question, I think we have time for one. But otherwise, I have put on the screen some more information about the resources to add to Karen's. So we would love it if you would complete our survey about the workshop today. The QR code is there. And also, if you would like to become a member of Playgroup New South Wales, we do cover all of New South Wales here at Playgroup, and we run more than 500 different types of playgroups a week across New South Wales. So from community volunteer-led through to supported playgroups. And we are passionate about supporting families in how they can actually support their children on the journey. So we want families to support their children. We always also want families to connect to each other, and that's part of what we do in these webinar series as well. So otherwise, I'm going to end the workshop, and thank you all for coming along and for your attention and for engaging. And thank you to you again, Karen, particularly for sharing your wonderful expertise at MARCS BabyLab. We enjoy partnering with MARCS, and we would really encourage families that we've known who've gone along and participated in research there have actually found it a really fun and enabling experience. So we'd really encourage you to encourage families to engage with MARCS as well. So thank you, everybody. And we'll see you at another webinar, hopefully.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for having me. Take care, everyone.